Usually when talking about rights in this country, we get immediately to great events. The March on Washington, the Gettysburg Address, the signing of the Civil Rights Bill. We ignore the fact that history is a dialectic, as Hegel posited, and those who contribute to the dialectic contribute to those events. One event is part of another. Black people in America freed themselves. They were the first to recognize their own inherent worth, since people are not born slaves but are enslaved. They freed themselves first by running away and rebelling when America was at its weakest, and then by dismissing the false claims made against them. If not for people like Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, Harriet Jacobs, Sojourner Truth, and Fredrick Douglass, we would never have gotten the Emancipation Proclamation. Without Thurgood Marshall, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Malcolm X, you would never have gotten the Civil Rights Act. What makes African Americans interesting is their advocacy manifested. I've talked about Marx a lot, but while his ideas were profound, he died poor and in obscurity. It's not enough to have good ideas, they must be disseminated. This is what makes African Americans such an interesting people, because they were the first people in history to free themselves. Other marginalized groups, like those under Spartacus, died in their attempts, but African Americans won. The peasants of Russia rebelled, but ended up under the yoke of Lenin and Stalin. The Jews of Europe sadly became the victims of one of the worst atrocities in history. But African Americans, while there are many rivers to cross, made steady progress. They have found meaning and identity when they had none. African Americans are a people who were compressed into their form, like a diamond. The African people have as well since colonization. What you're seeing in Africa currently is a new identity forged by the ancient cultures that have endured, and a confluence of new ideas from overseas. African Americans took their oppression and used it to create themselves. They are a people of spontaneous generation, like their music jazz. It's this spontaneous culture that makes them unique, since the Irish, you could say, also liberated themselves. True, but the Irish had a density on their island that enabled them to do so, and an ancient culture predating the partition. They had a language and customs. African Americans had that, but this was annihilated. Catholicism is still widely practiced, and Gaelic is making a comeback. But the proximity of slave and master made it impossible. That's why voodoo, among other African practices in the African dialect, is rarely found in the Americas. Yet, the segregation that persisted as a result of white ignorance allowed for a new culture to be given birth to. First starting as a small seed and slowly growing as African Americans liberated themselves, coming to a crescendo in the Harlem Renaissance, and then continuing afterwards. This new culture has been recorded from birth in a way few cultures have. There's not so much archaeologists left to determine the origins of Western civilization like ancient Greece, and few white cultures that came to America retained their culture. They became homogenized under WASP culture. Only African American culture, as a result of their ostracism and alienation, created something unique. African Americans, alongside Native Americans who fought to preserve their tradition, created something new and different. In terms of gaining their freedom, it was through mass dissemination of their culture. Writers are famous not for what they write, but also how they engage. That's why Marx died in obscurity while the Nazis took over the Weimar Republic. Pageantry beats good ideas. That's why Lucretius rhymed in his Nature of Things. And let's not circumnavigate the fact that Black people also fought back physically during the Revolution and Civil War. They rebelled and thereby gained concessions from those up top. You can't fight a war on two fronts. Black people recognized this and took the opportunity to burn the fields, run away, or kill people back home while the enslavers were off fighting. However, African Americans recognized the importance of not just beating their opponent physically, but beating them psychologically. When talking about African Americans, as far as literature is concerned, few places are better than Fredrick Douglass. Unlike Marx, as I said earlier, he emphasized not just ideas, but also their propagation. He recognized, unlike Marx, that people are not machines, but rather are compelled by emotion. Unlike the imbecile Sam Harris, who thought that science could answer questions of morality. As if looking through a telescope will tell you how empathy works. I would answer with a tweak of language from Shakespeare that virtue lies not in the stars, dear Harris, but in ourselves. His oratory was unmatched. Whereas Marx died in obscurity and Cicero was assassinated, Douglass endured. Douglass, as well as many African Americans, discovered the power of speech on their own and documented something that had never, to my knowledge, been so intricately described. And this is the story of the autodidact. Malcolm X would also, a century later, tell the tale of learning from the bare essentials. The guerrilla learner has an aptitude over formally trained individuals. Not only they have to learn fast, but they have to learn without a teacher. A mind-boggling event, only slightly less miraculous than God creating the universe from nothing. The autodidact will always be more learned than their formally educated brethren, because the person who has a teacher has been aided, and therefore his critical thinking will always be atrophied to some extent. I'm not against formal education or the use of teachers. I think most of humanity, they are needed, otherwise we would all be imbecilic. But for those individuals that can teach themselves, they are rare individuals, like people whose neurons fire faster, or some other gift that few people possess. It's something like child prodigies. I think Douglass needs to be seen as somebody like Mozart. But whereas Mozart explored music, Douglass explored psychology, even though perhaps maybe he didn't know it. Mankind's ability to overcome tremendous odds hadn't been seen in the effeminate circles of white society that had been castrated, so to speak, by their own privilege. Even poor whites in America weren't treated with the same amount of brutality, nor ancient slaves like Antara ibn Shaddad. This is the first time in history a person recorded a personal account, starting with nothing and then overcame by leaps and bounds.